And now it's time for the Third Crusade, which occurred between 1189 and 1192. Let's do a quick recap. So the First Crusade in 1095 to 99 established Western states in the Middle East. And then the Second Crusade was a failed attempt to restore Edessa or something. They never quite got around to figuring out what their strategic aims were. And in this Third Crusade, we'll see that this was actually motivated by the fall of Jerusalem. Now, previously I mentioned that the failure of the Second Crusade really managed to dull the appetite of Westerners for crusading. But once Jerusalem, the holy city of Christianity, fell, their appetite suddenly returned, and now we see that a lot of major figures were eager and willing to get involved in this struggle in the Near East. So without further ado, let's look at what happened and the events which led to the fall of Jerusalem in the first place. In my last video on the Second Crusade, I pointed out that the greatest long-term danger to the survival of the Crusader states was the rising power of their Muslim neighbors who were becoming more organized and more able to counter them militarily. Well, what we see is that this was a process which seemed like it would inevitably end in the triumph of the Muslim powers over the Crusader states. Now, after the Second Crusade, just to recap a bit, the states of Outremer were enraged at one another. They all blamed each other for the failure of the Second Crusade, so they really ceased cooperating, and it looked like they were on the verge of being picked off one by one. However, luckily for the Crusaders, the next 40 years were often occupied with conflicts between the Syrians and the Egyptians, as the Zengids of Syria fought against the Fatimids of Egypt, and, really didn't put too much pressure on the Crusader states. Now, what happens though is that there's a new ruler who emerges in Egypt, overthrowing the Fatimid Caliphate, and then he manages to invade his old homeland of Syria and conquer that as well. And then he will create a united Muslim power which will represent an existential threat to Outremer. So, who is this guy and what did he do? We'll find out in just a minute. I want to build some suspense, which seems odd when we're talking about something that happened nearly 1,000 years ago. And he really stunned the world, however, when in 1187 he managed to capture the city of Jerusalem, the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And that is the event that really stunned Europe and made this guy a household name. And his name, of course, was Saladin. Was the name of this new ruler who founded the state which unified Syria and Egypt. He was a Kurd by extraction, and he had actually gotten to Egypt in the first place by being the nephew of an ambassador from Syria. Later on, for whatever reason, the Fatimid government decided to make him a vizier, even though he was not a Shia Muslim, but rather a Sunni. And then from the late 1160s into the early 1170s, Saladin was working behind the scenes and making power plays, and by about 1171 or so, he had overthrown the Fatimid Caliphate, and he set up a new state which he called the Sultanate of Egypt. And he made a huge change when he decided to make this country Sunni, and he pledged his theoretical loyalty to the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, although he followed zero orders from the Abbasids, just like everyone else who wasn't living in Baghdad itself. Now, his first clash with the Crusaders of Jerusalem actually came as early as 1170, when he fought a border war when his sultanate was still just limited to Egypt. But he eventually intervened in Syria when he finally got the invitation he was looking for, and he captured the city of Damascus in 1174. And as I've mentioned in my previous video, Damascus was the key position if you wanted to be able to threaten the coastal holdings of the Crusaders. That's why it was a sought-after position. So once he has Damascus, now he is a true threat. And he was then delayed because there were periodic revolts in favor of both of these old regimes in both Egypt and Syria that he had to deal with. And some of these will also crop up, even sort of during the period of the Crusade itself. So he was a guy who had multiple fires to contend with, and we shouldn't oversimplify history and assume that he had this neat series of triumphs which were completely accepted by everyone under his rule. So actually that makes him a lot more impressive, because he has to deal with internal opposition while he is dealing with this huge crusade coming from the west. What about that crusade? What's going on in the west now that the news that Jerusalem has fallen has reached the Pope and the various kings of Europe? Keep in mind that by the time we get to the 1180s, the fact that Jerusalem was a Christian city had been established for several generations. It had been that way for going on a century, and it was just a normal expectation of life for everyone who was alive and in power that they could expect Jerusalem to be in the hands of their co-religionists. So that is why the fall of Jerusalem was so shocking for the various monarchs of Europe. So once the call for a crusade went out, Henry II of England and Philip II Augustus of France actually ended a war that they were fighting against each other and decided to go on crusade together to retake Jerusalem. And both of them would appear in person, according to this agreement. And also Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was now an old man and a veteran of the Second Crusade, where he had fought a skirmish with the Byzantines for no apparent reason, decided he also would join in on this crusade. So the three most powerful monarchs of Western Europe were all getting in on the action. Now, Henry II, who I pictured here, didn't quite make it to the Middle East because there was a succession dispute as he was about to leave. And his eldest son, Richard, was determined that he should be named as the heir to the English throne. But when he asked his father Henry about it, Henry kind of demurred and really didn't make it clear which of his three sons would become king. So Richard pledged his allegiance to Philip, and the two of them worked together to kill Henry, which put Richard on the throne. And we know him, of course, as Richard I the Lionheart, but I will make an argument in this video that we should really call him Richard the Dick, because this is a guy who proved himself to be insufferable time after time after time. And we'll see that his career of alienating everyone around him and being a complete prick continues throughout his lifetime and is the biggest factor in his long-term failure. So, after Richard kills his dad, he takes over as king and as the leader of the English contingent in the crusade. So, now we have Richard the Lionheart. That's how he got on this crusade. He's probably the most famous figure, unless you can make an argument for Saladin, one of the two most famous figures of the Crusade. By the time that the Third Crusade was declared, it was more or less an established fact of life that the Byzantine Empire would play a key role in any kind of crusade. After all, Alexius I had been somewhat the architect of the First Crusade and had been instrumental in the outcome of that conflict and in the aftermath. And his grandson Manuel had helped the Crusaders get to the Middle East, and then they had blamed him for not giving more direct support. And some of them were able to justify their own failures by blaming Manuel. So, this was kind of an established thing by this point that the Byzantine emperors would be heavily involved. But times had changed. The Byzantine Empire was going through some serious problems. The Komnenoi dynasty had fallen. The last heirs of Alexius had been removed from office when Andronicus I was killed in a riot, and power had passed to Isaac II Angelos. If you want to learn more about that, I've got an upcoming video on Byzantium, which will cover this. And what we see is that there were serious revolts against Byzantine power by rising countries like Serbia and Hungary, and also Bulgaria. So Isaac II had a pretty full plate by the time this rolled around. And things actually got a lot worse, because as they continued to strive for independence against Byzantium, the Serbs and Hungarians decided to go Catholic, and as Frederick Barbarossa's army marched through, they decided to appeal to him for aid against the Byzantines. Keep in mind, by this point, the schism of 1054 was a well-established fact, and there was no end in sight. So if you were an extremely hardcore Catholic, you could make the argument that fighting the Byzantines, who were not Catholic, was a worthwhile cause. So Isaac sees the obvious danger here, and he actually attempts to negotiate with Saladin, because at one point he assumes that Frederick Barbarossa will side with them and help them conquer Byzantium. It's also worth noting that a lot of the Byzantines did think that the Crusades were actually directed against them, and they had thought this for a long time, and this was an ongoing paranoia that they had. At any rate, another problem for Isaac is that one of the members of the Comnenus family had actually seized Cyprus, and he had done this in defiance of Andronicus, his own cousin or whatever. But he was still holding it, and Isaac had no control over that. But because this land was in theory Byzantine, anything that it did could be counted against Isaac. And this guy on Cyprus decided to fight a war with Richard the Lionheart as well. So in the end, Isaac was more or less powerless to do anything, and he ended up really humiliating himself by trying to negotiate with Saladin, then being forced to back out of it, and then providing support for Frederick Barbarossa's army. So a lot of Westerners by now had a pretty strong anti-Byzantine sentiment, and they felt like the Byzantines were not sufficiently supportive. And then the work of Isaac by trying to negotiate with Saladin really confirmed that in their minds and made them lose any remaining respect that they had for the Byzantine Empire and its role in defending Christendom. So the three crusading powers had two different paths to get to the Middle East. Frederick Barbarossa and his Holy Roman Imperial force decided to march overland through the Balkans and Byzantium. That's how he came into contact with Isaac II and how they had their interesting little Cold War. And he decides to basically follow the route that the First Crusade had taken and that he himself had taken as a subordinate of his uncle Conrad back during the Second Crusade. As for Richard and Philip, at this point they're still getting along really well, and they are moving their armies together by sea, which is faster and would avoid all of the potential pitfalls that the Germans had encountered during the 1140s. So they are planning to arrive by sea. Let's see how that goes. So as we discussed earlier, after some initial tension, Frederick Barbarossa was able to pass through Byzantium and enter into Asia Minor, where he intended to march across and then descend into the Holy Land via the north. And that seemed like a reasonable plan. The First Crusaders had done it with success. His Uncle Conrad had tried and failed. And maybe this was sort of Frederick's way of, avenging the honor of his uncle or something. I don't know. Anyway, let's talk about Frederick Barbarossa, since he's a really interesting figure, and I don't really plan on spending too much more time on the Holy Roman Empire, so this is a great opportunity to talk about its most important ruler. Now, he had been Holy Roman Emperor since 1155, and he is almost certainly the greatest and most successful of the Holy Roman Emperors, unless you're counting Otto I, but comparing someone to the founder is often not a fair comparison. One of his key achievements on the throne was actually reestablishing Roman law in his realm, and that was a way to try to separate himself from the authority of the Pope, so it was actually a pretty shrewd political move, and it also really reinforced this notion that his empire was Roman in some way. However, apparently the Roman laws that he reestablished did not include inheritance laws, because, as we've already know, the Holy Roman Empire became more and more subdivided among various little princelings, and it got absolutely chaotic. But under Frederick, it was still pretty powerful. Now, the name Barbarossa actually means something like the red-headed, and it refers to his very distinctive red hair and red beard. And by the time that the Crusade rolled around, Frederick was an old man of about 67 or 68, and he was a living legend. This is a guy with a larger-than-life personality. He had ruled the Holy Roman Empire for almost as long as, probably longer than most of his soldiers have been alive. And he's still a very active man. He's very outgoing and gregarious, very popular. And he actually dies in a way that's pretty sad. So as they're crossing one of the rivers in Anatolia, Frederick falls off his horse into the river, and since he's wearing his armor, he drowns before someone can fish him out. And because Frederick was such a big personality and a big presence, a lot of his men take this as a negative sign, and most of them go home. Some of them do continue on under a leader called Leopold of Austria, but most of them are disheartened enough that they just turn and go back to Germany. So at this point, Philip and Richard are in a bit of a honeymoon phase in their friendship. So obviously Philip had just put Richard on the throne of England, and Richard was pretty grateful. So the two of them are marching together through France with their armies, everything is good, and then the two of them are set to go to a different port, and each one of them will get ships and ship out to Sicily, and then from Sicily to Outremer, and then they're going to march on Jerusalem. Everything is set, everything is fine, but then things slowly start to fall apart. Now, Philip is a famous state organizer. Philip II Augustus, arguably the greatest French medieval king, and definitely the greatest state builder of that era for France. So he's an organized guy. He manages to get to Genoa, hire ships. Genoa's actually in Italy. I think I said South France earlier. Obviously, Genoa's Italy, so excuse my error there. He hires ships, and they set out for Sicily. No problems. Well, Richard gets to Marseille, which is one of the cities in Philip's realm, and his fleet isn't there because, once again, as in the Second Crusade, some of the English decided to stop off in Portugal and help out the Portuguese. So Richard gets impatient, and he's a little bit angry, and he decides to leave his men and race off to Sicily in person because he has some personal business to attend to. So when Richard's army rejoins him, he decides that he needs to intervene in Norman affairs. His father had arranged for the marriage of Richard's sister to King William II of Sicily, who was one of the greatest of the Norman leaders. But when William II died, William's heir decided to imprison Richard's sister, and Richard wasn't having any of that. So this is a bit of a detour and a bit of a diversion, but it's pretty understandable. I mean, obviously, if your sister's imprisoned and you happen to be in this distant land at the time, you got an army, it makes sense you'd do something. So, you know, I get it. But then Richard decides to do other stuff as well. He decides to break off his engagement to Philip's half-sister. That was part of their deal early on and one of the bases of their friendship. And then he randomly marries a princess from Navarre, which is at this time one of the Spanish kingdoms. It's a kingdom of the Basque, basically. So that is a major thing that he does, which starts to break up his friendship with Philip. Now Philip can't really trust Richard's word because not only did he go on a little bit of a detour, which would otherwise be understandable, but then he decided to randomly change his marriage arrangements. So this makes Richard look a little unstable in the eyes of his key ally. Because remember, not only will they crusade together, but they're planning to then go home and rule neighboring countries together. So this is not a very smart move diplomatically on Richard's part. And then Philip will be further annoyed when he reaches Outremer by mid-May, but Richard keeps getting into detours. So Philip is safely in the Middle East, and then at about the same time, Richard is sailing to the Middle East as well, now that he's dealt with his problems in Sicily, and he's taken his sister with him. And one of his ships happened to get grounded during a storm, and it happened to be his treasure ship. Well, this was seized by the ruler of Cyprus, who was Isaac Comnenus, one of the cousins of Manuel. And the two initially reached an agreement for that ship to be returned, but then Isaac decided to renege because he assumed Richard would leave, but Richard did not, and then he, to his credit, managed to somehow conquer Cyprus in only 5 days. So that was pretty impressive, but again, not part of what he was there to do. And while he was there, he met with the former king of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, and together they celebrated Richard's marriage to Berengaria, the Navarrese princess. So if you're Philip, you have to be fuming when you hear of all this. Richard decided to fight a side war, and then he followed through with the marriage to this princess that you disapproved of. Philip, at this point, may have still thought that he had a chance of getting Richard to see logic and marry his own half-sister, but didn't happen. So if you're Philip, you're already pretty peeved, and Richard at this point has committed to doing what he wants, and you know, if you're someone with an ego as big as his, it's hard to go back to reality from that point. Richard arrived a bit late for the Siege of Acre, but he still participated, and his contributions to the battle were decisive. He was by far the best general of this group of kings, and militarily at least, he was their superior in every conceivable way. So he brings this siege to a successful end, and now there is a conflict between the various leaders of this crusade over leadership in the Near East. So King Guy wants to be restored to power in Jerusalem. After all, he had been the king. But he has a subordinate named Conrad, I think of Montferrat or something like that, who decided that Guy's time had come and gone and that it was time for a change in leadership. Both are pretty reasonable positions. So what ends up happening is Richard uses his newfound prestige from the Siege of Acre to back up Guy. I mean, Guy was at his wedding, he must be a pretty good guy, and he must not have messed up as king. So Richard's backing him. However, Conrad happens to be related by marriage or by blood to both Conrad and Philip II. So they obviously side with Conrad. And this is a real butting of heads. Leopold, of course, I think as I explained earlier, was the guy leading the remaining Holy Roman Imperial troops who were part of this. So there was a deal struck between these leaders after, some very tense and nasty negotiations, that Guy would remain as king and he would be restored, but that he would have to adopt Conrad as his heir. So as a compromise, but ultimately Richard won out. And Philip and Leopold were both absolutely disgusted by the way that things had gone and the way that Richard had, strong-armed this process, that both of them decided to leave. Leopold because, he didn't really have that big of a stake in this anyway. His contingent wasn't big enough for him to compete with Richard. And Philip, both because he was tired of dealing with Richard and because he was suffering from some ill health. And that way, it's kind of fitting he has the nickname Augustus because Augustus also was a great state builder who had bad health. Anyway, so both of them leave the Middle East, and Philip, though, does leave behind 10,000 men and a lot of money to help pay them. So Richard, who is the best general, is now fully in control, or almost fully in control, of this crusade, and it is rolling forward from Acre, presumably to Jerusalem. So what happens from there? So with Richard firmly established as the key personality in the Third Crusade, and Saladin being the sultan of the regime that had captured Jerusalem, the most famous rivalry in the Crusade, and possibly the most famous rivalry of the entire Middle Ages, was set up. Now, Richard wanted to meet Saladin and negotiate for the return of Jerusalem, but Saladin said that kings could only meet after an agreement had been reached. And because of this difference in ideas about how negotiations should go down, the two of them never actually met face to face. Richard did, however, meet quite a bit with Saladin's brother as they tried to work this out. Now, there had been previous engagements, both by the locals and by the crusading force itself, which had resulted in the taking of prisoners by each side. So, Richard, being Richard, as this negotiation dragged out, decided to send a message to Saladin by taking the 2,700 prisoners he had and having them beheaded in front of Saladin's army. And Saladin had no choice but to retaliate in kind. So, if Richard had been hoping for a diplomatic solution, he basically flushed that opportunity straight down the toilet by doing that. So, now Richard is clearly intending to fight it out and take Jerusalem by force. So, let's see how this goes. I'm no fan of Richard the Lionheart, but I do have to cede to him that he probably was a military genius. He quickly realized that the best way to secure Jerusalem in the long run was to capture all of the coastal ports and isolate this area as much as possible. So he decided to march his army to Jaffa and secure the coast completely. And Saladin saw the danger as well, and he decided to intercept Richard's army at Arsuf. Now, the calculation by Saladin was that his harassing tactics would cause the Crusaders to divide, and if he could get some of the contingents to charge uncontrollably out of formation, he could then concentrate on beating those detachments and then wear out the army before it could reach Jaffa and force it to retreat. Richard, however, managed to keep his men in formation, and eventually, once one group did break formation, the Knights Hospitallers, they struck out, and then Richard decided, rather than letting them go on their own, to order an all-out counterattack, and it ended in actually a great victory for Richard, because he struck at just the right moment. He had that knack for timing that is something that generals really can't learn, either have or they do have, and Richard clearly had it. So Richard wins a great victory, and then marches on to Jaffa, and now he's in a position to threaten Jerusalem. But he doesn't end up taking it, so what went wrong? Well, let's talk about, again, Richard's personality and, the realities of war where a lot of opportunities are impossible to really follow up on. So the Battle of Arsuf seems to have been the first major defeat that Saladin had suffered in 20 or so years as a field commander. He was mostly successful in every other war. I mean, I'm not sure if he had lost a battle. And so getting beaten and beaten severely at Arsuf destroyed morale. And because of that, and because of logistical concerns, Saladin had to disband the majority of his army for the winter of 1191, and he probably knew that the citizens of Jerusalem would just simply surrender, and they didn't really have any fight in them, or they were still loyal to the Crusaders anyway, so, he probably in his own mind had already written off Jerusalem. However, Saladin got lucky, because Richard looked at how severe the winter was, and he knew that if he laid siege to this mountain city of Jerusalem and it didn't fall immediately, that he would be exposed to counterattacks, and that any relief force attacking him would catch him at a vulnerable time and state and could defeat him, because he knew that although he had inflicted a defeat on Saladin, Saladin could still raise another army. Maybe Richard actually overestimated Saladin's capacity to raise troops at that given moment, however. Anyway, so Richard decided that the only way he could possibly make a play for Jerusalem was if he had the support of Conrad, who had been established at, in another area in power. The thing is, though, Conrad decided that the only way he would help is if the throne was renegotiated and given to him. And Richard, he's looking out for himself, Richard being Richard, and he decided that Conrad could be king. But then he gave Guy Cyprus, which he had been holding on to up to this point, as a compensation. However, Richard was pretty angry that someone tried to play hardball with him. That was his role. So he had Conrad assassinated before he could be crowned, and then his pregnant widow married Richard's nephew. Now, granted, there is no certain proof that Richard had Conrad assassinated, but it is in keeping with everything else that we know about Richard. I mean, the man murdered his own dad. He's pretty much capable of anything, and he didn't like Conrad from the get-go, so he wouldn't have thought twice about paying some assassins to take out Conrad. So if you're wondering why Richard was unable to then exploit the weakness of Saladin now that he had Conrad on his side, well, the answer is twofold. One part is just Richard has a terrible personality and he's not really a good leader except when he's in battle. And the other part is that the other leaders of the Crusade were sick of dealing with Richard and they opposed him. So most of the leaders of the Crusade, most of the other nobles there, wanted to attack Jerusalem. That was the obvious move, and it was the reason they were there. But Richard, being a dick, decides to say that, okay, if you guys vote to do that, I'll go with you, but I will not serve as your leader, even though I'm by far the best general. Because I think the appropriate course of action is to attack Egypt. Now, later Crusaders will take this idea up of attacking Egypt. There's a whole crusade that was launched in Egypt. But for the moment, Jerusalem was open to the taking, and there was really no reason to not take it, except that Richard wanted to get his way. And this also points to the problem that while Richard was by far the most important and most prestigious of the leaders assembled, the crusading army was not the English army, therefore he couldn't just command it at fiat as he was accustomed to. And he didn't really have the ability to get along with other people well enough to lead by example and persuasion. So as the Crusaders are approaching Jerusalem, this is when Richard throws his tantrum, and they could easily have taken the city, but they decide to retreat because they don't want to be without Richard as their leader. And then they retreat back to the coast, and then they don't invade Egypt, they just kind of hang out, because now they're at an impasse. The other leaders are also pretty much furious with Richard, he's furious with them, and they're just going to sit there and argue all the time. And that is what causes the initiative to pass back to Saladin. So now what is Saladin going to do? At this point, Richard was on the verge of returning to England and pulling a full Cartman by saying, "Screw you guys, I'm going home." But Saladin had other ideas. So as the Crusaders are still bickering and Richard is away from Jaffa, Saladin launches a surprise attack in force and takes Jaffa in July. The garrison of Jaffa was mostly butchered. Some of them were saved when they took refuge in the citadel, and Saladin was willing to spare them, but his men were a lot less merciful because of previous atrocities by the Crusaders. So at this point, you know, the pattern of exchanging atrocities was pretty well established, and there was no fixing it. Anyway, so Richard decides that this will be a great opportunity for him to gain further glory, so he gathers a force of 2,000 men and launches his own surprise attack. And he manages to take the city by surprise. Saladin thought Richard was already gone, and he was surprised when Richard arrived so quickly. So since Saladin, though, after Richard had retaken the city, Saladin had the upper hand. He had a much bigger army, so he decides to try to take Jaffa by surprise once again. But again, Richard is a very good general, and he is not taken by surprise easily. So he figures out this plan, and then Saladin decides, well, I still have the numbers, I'm just going to overwhelm Jaffa. So he launches a big assault, and it fails. He loses a lot of men, and at this point, the two men realize that they aren't going to be able to break the impasse. Saladin has recovered sufficiently that the momentum that Richard had earlier is totally gone, and Saladin is much stronger. However, Richard is a far better general and will probably continue to humiliate Saladin. So both of these guys now are at an understanding that it is best for them to just quit while they're ahead. And that's more or less exactly what they do. So basically, both sides decided to make a compromise. Richard decided to allow Saladin to continue to rule over Jerusalem so long as Jerusalem remained open to unarmed Christian pilgrims and merchants. So Christians were still free to travel to and do business in Jerusalem, but they could not bring arms there, and it was a recognized part of Saladin's empire. Keep in mind that as a Muslim, Saladin and his followers also believed that Jerusalem was a holy city, so it contained just as much symbolic importance for them as it did to the Christians. Neither side was really satisfied with the results of this war and the ending of it. So Saladin and his successors would look to finish off the Crusader states in due time, and the Christians would also want to reclaim Jerusalem, and they also would take up this idea of attacking Saladin's base of power in Egypt as a permanent solution for preventing the Muslims from having enough power to really threaten Jerusalem again. So both sides are looking to fight it out just at a future date. There also are a lot of hurt feelings on the Crusader side against Richard. So Leopold of Austria is still really angry about Conrad's murder. He was close to Conrad, so as Richard is trying to return, Conrad actually has him arrested, Leopold has him arrested. Conrad is dead, clearly he doesn't do it. Leopold has him arrested and imprisoned for a couple years. He hands him over to the Emperor Henry VI, and Henry demands a huge ransom from England to get Richard released, and he gets it. However, Philip II is still also angry at Richard, and he wants Richard to be gone as long as possible, so he actually extends Richard's prison sentence by about 6 months by bribing Henry. So, can you imagine like how unpopular you have to be to get a sovereign of a nation to pay large amounts of money that he needs to be spending on other stuff to keep you in prison. That's how much Philip II was aggrieved at Richard. As for Saladin, he actually didn't end up living much longer. He ended up dying of yellow fever in 1193, and then his heirs ended up fighting over his empire. It looks like Egypt and Syria were separated and went their own ways after this. So the state that he tried to found didn't end up really taking off too well. Let's look at the interesting epilogue of the Third Crusade. So, Frederick Barbarossa, of course, had drowned early on, and the Germans had not really played much of a role. However, Henry VI was eager to avenge his father's failure in the eyes of the international community, so he organized his own crusade in 1197. Partly he was renewing the rivalry of his father with the Angelos dynasty in Constantinople, and he was already putting out threats to the current Emperor Alexius III, and it's possible that he would have done something like what happened in the Fourth Crusade had he actually left. However, Henry VI, as he was gathering his forces in Sicily, suddenly died, and then the Crusade of 1197 quickly fell apart because most of his crusaders went home to participate in the power struggle in the Holy Roman Empire. Because remember, it's an elective monarchy, and anytime a really powerful figure like a Henry VI dies, there's going to be a disputed election. So, this crusade ended up not really happening, and I assume that most of the men who went to the Middle East ended up just kind of entering into the service of the existing Outrimmer states. So, that's how the Third Crusade ended. But I think it's clear how the Fourth Crusade will get started. There's still a lot of unfinished business in the eyes of the Western Europeans, and they also don't really have a lot of respect left for the Byzantine Empire at this point. So we'll talk about what happens in the Fourth Crusade, but not before we catch up on Byzantine affairs up to this point.